Well, welcome everyone. Welcome, Sam. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Sure, glad to be here.
I, uh, I'm not actually sure how to introduce you. I feel like there are so many different facets to who you are. I'm not even sure how to focus on. So I guess maybe I'll just let you introduce yourself. What do you think is
Oh,
most
well,
important
yeah,
that we know?
no pressure, right? Well, my name is Sam Duncan. I am a historian of modern America, um, not a historian of of European conflict, as it were, but I do teach classes in modern American history and modern world history. I'm also a veteran. Served for almost 6 years in the 82nd Airborne Division in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, as a cannon crew member, artillery howitzer gunner, and eventually became a Jumpmaster in the 82nd. Um, Other than that, I'm a father of two great kids, a husband of a woman who's truly my better half, and just trying to make my way through the world as best I can as a good man, as a good husband, as a good father, as a good Christian and believer, and that's about all I can hope for.
I guess so. One of the things that I've always appreciated about you, Sam, is you have always been kind of a steady uh, personality, over the years, whether it was a conversation about faith, whether it was a conversation about the armed services, a conversation about history or current events. You just have always been a real patient, level-headed, and kind person in your interactions, and I've appreciated that, and how wise, oftentimes, I think, your responses have been. And so, as I've just been following the news over these last few days, I wish we lived in the same place. I live in South Florida. You live up in northeastern Ohio, and I've often thought to myself, I wonder what's going through Sam's head. And a couple of days ago, I just said to myself, I should just reach out and ask Sam what's going through his head. So, hopefully, tonight we can pick your brain just a little about what's going on and what you're thinking, and what you're seeing through your lens.
Well, the short answer is a lot is going through my head. But let's be honest, you don't want to be in Northeast Ohio. Just look at the different complexion between the two of us on camera here.
The weather down here is nice this time of year. You just got to avoid the hurricanes.
Yeah, I feel like I haven't been outside in 6 months. Um, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess there's a lot of things going through my head, especially in the last couple of days. I just recently saw an article yesterday about American veterans who are volunteering to go over to Ukraine to help train, and maybe not to fight, but to go over there and help train Ukrainian soldiers and even civilians on how to use some of the equipment that we have and that other nations have contributed to Ukrainians' bid to maintain their sovereignty. And that's been sort of a thing weighing on my mind a lot. Is that something that I would want to do? Is that something that I feel like I should do? When I left the Army in 2006, I didn't take a vow or anything, but I kind of committed myself to nonviolence at that point. I didn't see a path forward in life or in the world or in humanity where violence was ever a way that was going to achieve anything useful or good. This is a little bit different situation, which caused me to rethink some of those things. That, unlike some of the conflicts that we've been embroiled in the past, I mean, there's a clear right and wrong, I think, to what is going on in Ukraine, and that's something that American soldiers who've been embroiled in conflict and battle for the past 20 years haven't really had a clear sense of. The war on terror was a different beast. It was a different endeavor. So that's one of the things that's been weighing on my mind. Apart from that, I mean, I guess it would be if there were specific questions,
Yeah.
I don't know how deep into the recesses of Sam Duncan's mind.
Well,
Anybody
as deep as you want to take us. Yeah, it's fascinating though that was the first thing that you said, because I have to admit that this has been both a spiritual, I think, exercise for me the last week or two, as well as a patriotic, nationalistic exercise for me. I consider myself, if not a full pacifist, close to a full pacifist, on the basis of my faith. But over the last week or so, what I've realized about myself is my faith is full or close to full pacifism, but for the state, for the nation, for the country, um, I find myself cheering for war, or cheering for some sort of active involvement or engagement against what I characterize as pure, unadulterated evil and sin, a bully, the likes of which the world may have not seen on this level for a long time in this way. Um, and it's been difficult for me to wrestle with those two sides of me and see, do they need to be reconciled? Can they live together? It's been tough. So the fact that you kind of pointed that out as well, as a veteran, is kind of fascinating to me.
Well, I think that's the dilemma for any Christ follower, right? Is how far does turn the other cheek go? How committed can you be to nonviolence? I always think about Gandhi in this regard. Gandhi was asked one time during World War II, could nonviolence work against someone like Hitler? And his response was yes, but it would cost an enormous amount of life and sacrifice. And I guess that's really the question, as Christ followers and believers, like how committed to the ideas of nonviolence can we be? And how does that sort of conflict with and entangle with our desire to minimize human suffering? Because there would be a tremendous amount of human suffering if we were to be wholly committed to nonviolence in this regard. And to be honest with you, my opinions on this stuff change hour to hour. And I find myself in 1 hour thinking, like, we should just, if he wants war, then war, let's have war. And then there's an hour later, I'm thinking we got to do everything we can to avoid war. We exhaust all possibilities beyond that.
I'm glad to know, Sam, that as a person of faith, as a veteran, and as a historian, that you are conflicted and change your opinion in your mind as much as I feel like I have. So I'm not alone in that. I felt like I was.
Yeah, no, I've flipped back and forth, and I can't really. It's hard. It's hard to settle on a path forward.
So let me ask you this, and this may be a loaded question, and obviously you can turn down any question that you don't want to answer. In your perspective, how have we so far handled this? I know that part of it comes down to where you sit on what side of the aisle, but I have been fascinated watching the government, watching Biden, watching Congress walk through this to this point. And in moments, I thought that they were crazy in the way they handled something. And then, 3, 4, 5 days later, I think, oh, wow, that was probably really, really smart. But through your lens, how have you felt about how just overall we've been handling it as the U.S.?
To be honest, I think we've probably been handling as good as it could be handled at the moment. But here's sort of the view from 10,000 feet as I see it, is that what are the options here? There's no indication that Putin would ever stop with just Ukraine. I mean, his vision, what he has been committed to for the past quarter century has been the revival and reinstitution of not only the old Soviet Union, right, but a larger Slavic empire. That's kind of been his fever dream for quite some time, and that may have been exacerbated by the pandemic and isolation and everything that goes along with the past 2 years. That may have just sort of heightened that to a level that people who have studied Putin for the past 20 years are seeing disconcerting things about his behavior. So there's no indication that he would stop. There was no indication that Hitler would stop, right? When he annexed Austria in 1938, and then he took over part of the Czechoslovakian Sudetenland, and then it was all of Czechoslovakia. And then by 1939, he invades Poland. And Winston Churchill's criticism of UK Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain at the time was that, okay, you appeased Hitler, you opted for shame instead of war, and you got war anyway, right? You violated your principles to avoid war, but you got war anyway. And there's some of that I sense in what's going on now, right? Every effort we're making, I don't know that war is even avoidable at this point. You already have Putin saying things like, even the global economic sanctions are tantamount to a declaration of war.
Right.
So he's already laying the groundwork for warfare no matter what. Best case scenario, the absolute best case scenario for Putin is that the rest of the world does nothing. He takes Ukraine, but then he's sitting there occupying a country of 40 million people who don't want him there. That's a long-term occupation. That's a lot of drain on Russian money and resources and manpower. And it would likely, in combination with global sanctions, lead to the collapse of Russia as a state. I don't think there's anybody who would argue with the fact that a collapsing Russian state in the hands of Vladimir Putin is a dangerous scenario, because it would likely invite a lash out toward the people he sees responsible for that, toward NATO nations. So even if we do nothing, we may end up with a war anyway. And if we do what some people are wanting, and even President Zelensky in Ukraine are wanting us to do, and lend, sort of revive the Lend-Lease program of World War II, and lend planes and even personnel, or at least advisors, to Ukraine. Now we're actively involved, which would likely lead to war. A no-fly zone absolutely leads to war, because somebody has to enforce it. And once you start shooting down Russian planes, now you're in an all-out war. So I don't even know that war is inevitable or is avoidable.
It's avoidable, yeah.
Which is a terrible thing to think. And I don't have the faith that some other people seem to have that he will not use nuclear arsenal. Combined with his erratic behavior, combined with longstanding Russian policy, that if you are losing, you use the nuclear arsenal. I don't think there's any indication. I don't think it's conceivable that he wins a war against NATO, even a conventional war. So any warfare at all, I think, leads toward the path of utilizing nuclear weapons.
So it sounds like you think we're already in World War III.
Sadly, yeah, I do. I cling to some hope, which is why I'm not really on board with the people who want to institute a no-fly zone at the moment. I still cling to some hope. Maybe I am like Neville Chamberlain in 1939, but the consequences of engaging in a war that leads to the use of nuclear weapons, to me, that's worth avoiding at all costs. Because whatever the consequences are for any other course of action, those consequences hit on a level that we haven't seen since 1945.
Yeah, I was going to ask. I don't even know if you have an answer to this, Sam. But what happens if he launches a nuclear weapon? Like what?
In some ways, it becomes an. You ever seen the movie War Games with Matthew Broderick? In some ways, it becomes an automated series of retaliations at that point. You know, the launch of a nuclear weapon instigates several sort of domino effects.
A domino effect.
But I think even more disconcerting than that, there's this feeling here in America that our military will protect us, and that's not really the case. once you are embroiled in a nuclear war, because the first thing that the first thing that protocol would have the military do in that case is to protect command and control function. So they would not be protecting the American people. They would instead be grabbing the leaders of our nation and enacting protocols to secure command and control functions.
So my wife's fear of something hitting South Florida is not far-fetched.
I don't know. I would guess that densely populated regions are going to would be targets in that.
But nothing's safe. Nothing's safe.
Nothing's safe. But I wouldn't go. I don't know that when I say that he would use the nuclear arsenal, there's levels to that, right? There's battlefield nuclear utilization, and then there's intercontinental ballistic. And even at the most strained rational, even at straining the rational behavior at its most chaotic, I would have a hard time believing that Putin or anybody else, or more importantly, any of the generals in the Russian army, would institute or enact an intercontinental nuclear strike. That to me seems pretty far-fetched. I could be wrong, but the use of nuclear weapons are in and of themselves horrible, horrible, horrible consequences, regardless if they're small nuclear weapons on a battlefield. Right. None of the nuclear arsenal that the world currently holds is as small as the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and those were horrendous weapons of destruction. So we're talking multiple times the destructive power of those weapons. It's disheartening.
So Sam, as a historian, when you see all of this unfolding, you obviously have a much clearer and stronger grasp on world history in a way that most of us can't even touch. What, in a historical lens, do you see, compare, contrast to world history?
Well, I think the obvious comparisons are with Germany and Hitler. In 2014, Putin invaded and annexed Crimea, which was tantamount to what he did in 1938 in Austria, and then in the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. And then Putin had troops in eastern Ukraine in a sort of what should have been a demilitarized area, which was a violation of the treaties or accords, I should say. But Hitler did the same thing in 1933 when he demilitarized the Rhineland along the borders of France and Belgium. And at the time, there was that sense, right, that if we let him go, we don't provoke a war. All right, he put troops on the border, we'll let it go. He annexed Austria. Austria kind of wanted to be a part of Germany anyway, so we'll let that go. People said the same thing in 2014 about Crimea, that many of the people in Crimea was given to Ukraine back in the 60s or no 80s. No, it was early. It was during Khrushchev's administration. During Khrushchev's administration, Crimea was given to Ukraine. It had been part of Russia. So many people thought in 1991, when Ukraine broke off after the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of people thought Crimea should have gone back to Russia at that point. So when Putin annexed Crimea in 2014, there was some outrage over it, but ultimately the global community said, fine. A lot of the Crimean people, a lot of the people living in Crimea are ethnically and culturally Russian. They speak Russian. They wanted to be part of Russia. They thought that Crimea should go back to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union anyway. So they let it go. And then he started militarizing and putting troops on the border in demilitarized areas along the border of Ukraine. And again, there was sort of a global wagging of the finger, but they let it go. So there's those kind of obvious comparisons. I think what's less obvious is the rhetoric for Putin's justification for entering Ukraine, which was the denazification and demilitarization.
Yeah, I didn't really understand any of that.
Well, that goes back to, so it goes back to 1941, but it really goes back to how you view Ukrainian independence and the move of Ukrainians to establish their own independent republic. Putin sees that as beginning in 1941. And what happened in 1941 was that Nazi Germany invaded Ukraine, and many Ukrainians sided or collaborated with Nazi occupiers in the hopes to throw off Soviet rule. But the reason they sided with Nazi occupiers was primarily because they had been trying to establish an independent republic since 1917. They fought the Bolshevik Red Army in 1917. The Ukrainians did, trying to establish their own independent nation. And they did. They established the Ukrainian People's Republic in 1917. But by 1922, the Soviet Union had enveloped Ukraine and made it part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So they were taken over by 1922. In the 1930s, Soviet policy aimed at collectivization led to the Great Famine, killing about 13% of the Ukrainian population, something like 3.9 million people at the time. And so there was a sense that Soviet rule was this oppressive, destructive, horrible rule, and the Ukrainian people had been long seeking independence. So in 1941, they saw Nazi Germany as their best chance. Once Germany invaded, they saw Nazi Germany as their best chance to gain independence. They became pretty quickly disillusioned with that, and Ukraine became one of the more prolific spots of the executions of the Holocaust. They became embroiled in the Holocaust. By some accounts, 1 in 4 victims of the Holocaust were murdered in Ukraine. So that is what Putin is alluding to, is that any Ukrainian independent movement, any movement of Ukrainians who want to pull away from Russia has to be Nazified, or it has to be a Nazified military or a Nazified political regime. That's Nazi talk, to want to pull away from Russia. That's what he's alluding to. But in doing that, he's completely skipping over the 1917 independence movement and the fact that Ukrainians had for decades earlier wanted independence from the Soviet and had been suppressed or subjugated under Soviet rule long before that. So that's one of the things as a historian I find troubling, is that it's Putin's use of and rewriting of history as a way to try to justify these actions. And,
well, we've seen a lot of rewriting of history recently, haven't we?
Yeah. And that's the only message that Russian state media is putting out to people. So if you're living in Russia, what information are you getting that's countering that rewriting of history? I think it's a lesson for us all to sort of be wary of those who would, subjugate the historian's gaze for their, political interpretation of history.
It must be a maddening era to be a historian in, with all of the desire to rewrite, to subjugate, to completely ignore history.
Yeah, or to reshape it to suit one's own sort of ideological agendas. Yeah.
So you and I talked a little bit when you corrected me a little bit about genocide. Help me understand the human side of this and how it compares to some of the other things that we've seen on the world stage.
Yeah. I mean, so The only thing I pointed out in my quote unquote correction.
I don't mind being corrected.
Yeah, it's genocide is one of those words that people use a lot, probably overuse a lot. Um, Genocide was it was a term that was coined because of the Holocaust. It was actually out of the Nuremberg trials and shortly thereafter that the term was first coined to refer to the Holocaust. There are some people who say that's where it should end. That is, the term genocide should refer specifically and only to the Holocaust, and we shouldn't apply it in any other context. I'm not that hardline about it. But I think there are a couple things about the word genocide that I think have to be, there's a certain criteria that has to be met. The UN has their criteria that has to be met for that word. And it's pretty steep. For the UN to call something genocide, it actually has to meet a high threshold. One of the key factors, if we think about it in the context of the Holocaust, what was the Holocaust? It was a systematic, targeted extermination of a people. And that was the goal. Not to exterminate those people because you were at war with those people, not to exterminate those people because you were trying to subjugate their nation state,
right?
But to exterminate them because they were those people.
So it's not yet clear that that's Putin's goal, is to exterminate these people, I guess.
I think it's kind of clear that it isn't, just in the fact that he has alluded to Ukraine as being culturally and ethnically, religiously tied to Russia, that these are, his sense. Argument is actually quite the opposite, that the Ukrainians are Russian people. Now, that's not really true either. They do share a lot of cultural similarities, and they share a shared history. They have a shared history. But I don't think his goal is the extermination of the Ukrainian people as such. I think more than anything, Putin's goal, and this is just me speculating here, I don't think a successful Ukraine is something that Putin's regime can stand. And I think that's true of any of the former Soviet states in his immediate sphere. I don't think that his own regime can withstand seeing one of those other nations become successful. And Ukraine, he needs those states to be dependent on Russia. And when Ukraine got rid of their highly pro-Putin, pro-Russia prime minister and president and got rid of him because that president rejected relations with the EU, the Ukrainian-European Union relations in 2012. When that president rejected forging those ties with the European Union, the people threw him out, and they elected a young, westward-looking, democratic president. And it seemed like Ukraine was moving toward more modernization, a stronger economy, political independence, democratic will and sovereignty. And if you're Vladimir Putin and you're running a kleptocratic, autocratic society where the people are pretty much subjugated, where their democratic will gets the facade of a voice, but it's really no voice, and your people are looking at their neighbors in Ukraine and how successful that nation is becoming, you can't let that go. It undermines everything about your own regime. So I think part of what Putin is doing, he can't allow any of those former Soviet states to become successful. He needs them to remain dependent to legitimize his own place.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you mentioned, I think you were talking about Zelensky there. As a world leader, how does Zelensky stack up to other leaders?
On a personable level, I mean, I think it's no question that he has really sort of mastered what it means to cultivate that persona of every man. Right. People look at people in Ukraine, and even people in the United States, they look at Zelensky and they think like he's one of us. We could absolutely, that could be me. That could be my brother. That could be my dad. they see something in Zelensky. In some ways, he's sort of the best kind of populist, right? We use the word populist in a way,
What does that mean?
History, at least, that has a negative connotation because it sort of drums up chaos and mob rule and those kind of things. But I think Zelensky's kind of what a populist shows what a populist could be in a good, positive context, in that he inspires a lot of the average, everyday working men and women to see themselves, in the government. They see the government as them, which is, we have this thing in the United States where we like to, even though we're a democratic society who elects our own governors, we see them as like government is something else. It's not those people we elected for some reason. It's some other entity, nefarious entity intruding on our lives. But I think what Zelensky does is he cultivates this persona that makes people see that the government is me. The government is working for me. It's because it is me. And that's a very enchanting kind of thing. I've been very, I think like most people over the past couple of weeks, I've just been struck by the guy and how earnest and forthright and, just I think, I don't even know, virtuous. And it could be the gaze of the filter of him being juxtaposed against what is obviously a tyrant and bully. But I don't think so. I think there's something about Zelensky that I think it's why he was elected in the first place, is that he sort of comes across as that everyman.
Sanctions.
Yeah. What about those?
I have been both incredibly amazed at what has been done, especially just by companies, U.S. corporations getting involved in sanctioning and shutting things off. The other side of me thinks I don't ever want to be on the targeted end of those things. If they can turn off all of those things, that's terrifying. I mean, turn off Disney Plus, and my house is it's going to be World War IV in the Young household if Disney Plus goes down. And I've often wondered too, if I were a Russian, the sanctions I know are seemingly, and correct me if I'm wrong, to move Putin, but it seems as though it's almost more to move the nation to press Putin to stop. So it's pressure on the average Joe and Jane in order to hopefully move the government. But my question is, are they really going to blame Putin for those things, or are they going to blame the West for that? Could it have a kickback in the opposite effect where it could actually steal their resistance against the West and Putin come out the hero in this? So and oil and gas and all these things, it's just so much is going on. Any thoughts about sanctions?
Yeah, no, I think you raised exactly the right question. Is it going to put pressure on the Russian people? Well, it puts pressure on the Russian people, but is that pressure going to lead to internal disruption to where they attempt to take the reins back from Putin, or pressure Putin to move in this direction or that direction? Or is it just going to make them anti-American? That's the difficult sort of dilemma with sanctions in Iran. For the better, since the 1970s, what our relationship with Iran has been boycotts and sanctions, and it has led to a vitriolic hatred of Americans in a lot of ways. The same thing with Cuba. In many instances, it's led to more animosity than it has changing anything about what the sanctions were supposed to change. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is there. I mean, with Russia, we do know they have a history of internal disruption. From 89 to 91, we saw the result of what can happen when you have a collapsing society, a collapsing economy, a collapsing political system, collapsing faith of the people in their government, whether they have any sort of democratic mechanism to affect change at that point is neither here nor there. A certain amount of disruption, it doesn't matter if it's democratic or not. You're going to see some breaks in the wall, as it were. And I don't know. I'm hopeful that the sanctions will do something. What I'm really kind of disappointed about more than anything is the American reaction to some of these sanctions. And I understand the pain, right? The pain of high gas prices, or the pain of exacerbating what was already a tense situation with inflation. But for all of the chest thumping I hear people engaging in constantly, and even people are saying we should go to war, or we should put boots on the ground over there, we should shoot Russian planes out of the sky. For all of that kind of chest thumping, that situation would lead to a much greater economic upheaval. If you think gas prices are high now, let war break out in Europe, all-out war between NATO and Belarus and Russia, and see what the economy looks like then. And for all of that chest thumping, I don't know. I don't have, call me cynical, but after 2 years of people not wanting to put a piece of cloth on their face, I find it probably improbable that they're going to make the kind of sacrifices that my grandparents did, right? They're going to ration bread. They're going to ration sugar, meat, rubber. They're going to contribute to the warfare. They're going to convert their textile factories over to making parachutes. They're going to convert their motor factories over to making tanks and engines. Call me cynical. I don't think the American public has that in them anymore. They become, for lack of a better word, hedonistic and selfish and self-centered in some ways. And that's sad. That's really, really sad and disconcerting. The sanctions, I don't know, like, I understand the point of them. I don't want everyday citizens of Russia, men and women who are just trying to live their lives and work and raise their kids and care for their families. I hate the thought of them suffering to the degree that they would suffer with their collapsed economy. So yeah, this is one of those things where I, again, flip back and forth on, where I feel differently at any different time during the day.
Couple more questions, Sam, and you may have stuff you want to say that I'm not asking to, which is fine. I wanted to ask, as we move forward, what do you think is going to happen? What's your prediction? But maybe a better question is, which you can answer that if you want, but maybe a question is, what are you watching for? What are you listening for? What are you paying attention to as we move forward? What do you think are the major indicators that you're listening for, rather than what the media or anyone else tells you is important to watch? What do you watch?
To be honest, I'm not really sure. The things I would want to watch for are things that none of us are really privy to, and that's sort of Putin's interpersonal dealings and actions, like how we see only snippets.
So we just got to trust.
What's that?
So we just have to trust.
Yeah, we only see snippets of his behavior. We only hear snippets of his rhetoric. So I don't know. I mean, the people who have studied him most say that it doesn't look good. I mean, out of a Senate intelligence briefing the other day, Senator Marco Rubio came out and said, yeah, something's off with him. I'm not privy to what they're privy to in those.
Something's off with Putin or with Rubio?
Well, it could be either, but Rubio was saying that something was off with Putin. And he said that in a news briefing as he was coming out of an intelligence briefing. So apparently he's getting that from our intelligence agencies, which is disconcerting, to say the least. So I don't know what I would look for.
That's an honest answer. It kind of means we have to, on some level, trust those who are in charge and who are leading us, which I guess kind of leads me to my next question without being overly political, which I don't care if you are necessarily. How do you think Biden has done or is doing as a president, being handed all of this and having to roll with it? What is your assessment of how Biden and his government is doing?
Yeah. I mean, given the circumstances, I think he's probably doing as well as anybody could do under those circumstances. I mean, what do you do when how would any president handle a country invading another sovereign country, but that sovereign country is not one to which you have the right kind of ties, membership in NATO, that would provoke your direct involvement? Like, what do you do?
Yeah. Some of the things I've heard, if some other guy were in there, we would have immediately stopped this and sent in troops in a no-fly zone. Some of the other things, that I've heard is Biden it doesn't seem sympathetic or empathetic enough, that he's not visible enough to the American people, shepherding, or whatever the political word for that is. So, I guess maybe when you think about other wartime presidents, I just kind of wondered what your assessment was. Is Biden a complete failure? Is he a hero, or is he just somewhere in between, doing the best he can, and he seems to be doing okay so far?
Well, the idea that he's not doing well because he's not out and visible enough, that's absurd. That's laughably absurd. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't like he was out on a campaign tour or something, or a rally somewhere. He was in the Oval Office dealing with the possibility of an impending nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Did I lose Kevin?
Nope, I'm still here.
Oh, okay. All right.
You know what happened was a kid needed to walk behind me. So.
Oh, okay. All right.
My desk is right in the middle of the house, so to get from one side to the other, you got to go through the video screen. Okay. Sorry, I cut you off, and it was fascinating.
No. I just, Kennedy was not out there visible during the Cuban Missile Crisis. How many times was Woodrow Wilson out on the campaign or at rallies or out in public during World War I? Not very much. Roosevelt was famously not an exceedingly public figure during World War II. Part of that had to do with the fact he was in a wheelchair, but part of it also is because it turns out that dealing with a fascist authoritarian bent on invading sovereign nations and taking over territory requires some work. And if my sense of this is, if I see Biden too much out in public in a situation like this, that would concern me, because I think he needs to be in the Oval Office somewhere quarterbacking the situation, which it seems like he's doing. The idea that other administrations might have handled this better is also laughably absurd. And, I don't want to get, like you said, I don't want to get too political, but, the previous administration was talking about withdrawing from NATO. The previous administration didn't act on actionable evidence that Putin was putting bounties on American soldiers' heads in Afghanistan. Like, the idea that somehow he would be tougher on Putin it doesn't mix, or it doesn't match with the evidence at hand. That's not to say, I'm not trying to make any sort of political statement there. I'm just saying that in the situation that we have with this kind of invasion, with this kind of autocrat, with who's really not accountable to anyone, what do you do in that situation? I think this administration is doing everything that really can be done short of going to war. And I think, as I said before, at the top of this thing, going to war, I think, means acknowledging that we're going to engage in a nuclear war. We're going to bring about that which we have sought very hard to avoid since 1945. And I think people need to be honest about that. If you want to say we need to do more and we need to have no-fly zones, and if it leads to war, it leads to war, fine, but acknowledge that you're okay with nuclear war. Acknowledge that. Own it. Otherwise, be as conflicted as I am, because that's where I'm at.
Which is a great lead into my last question. How do you talk to your kids about this? What do you think is important to say? Is there anything that you think shouldn't be said? I can't remember. Your kids are what, high school, late middle school, right?
Preston will be starting high school next year.
Yeah.
Mackenzie will be starting middle school next year.
Yeah, and I know some kids are younger, some kids are older, and there's sometimes maybe age appropriate things. But for you, from your perspective, how do we give our kids a lens to help understand what's going on, even when we don't fully understand what's going on?
No, and for me, that's the thing, is just acknowledging that I don't understand what's going on. That is the lens that I use to talk to my kids. Like, this is chaos. This is man's evil against mankind, and I don't understand it. I don't understand why on this small rock floating around a solar system, which is floating around a galaxy, which is floating around a universe, and there's nobody else like us for billions of miles around that we know of. I don't understand why we have to be so short-sighted and fight each other over who has ownership of this arbitrary line drawn on the map on this, this particular geographic area. It all seems silly and absurd from the scale that I think that most of us should probably look at it. So I'm forthright with the kids that I'm frustrated. I'm sad. I get angry. I try to cling to hope. I try to remain hopeful that there's a way forward that doesn't involve war. And if there is a way forward that doesn't involve war, we should pursue that at all costs, because war is insanity. War is terrible. And anybody who's been close to one knows that that's not the way forward. That's not the way to progress. That's not the way to achieve anything but destruction and death. And so I don't know if that really answers your question, but
it does.
I just try to be as honest as I can about that. And they're at the age where they can process that. If they were younger, I would probably couch that in different terms. But I would still try to remain honest that there are things that happen in the world that mom and dad wrestle with ourselves. We don't have all the answers, but the best we can do is to try to do good where we see the opportunity to do good.
Well, Sam, I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule tonight to do this. Yeah. Anything at all that I haven't asked, or that you think is important or necessary for us to know, or that you want to say?
No, I don't have anything particular. I don't know if anybody I wasn't really, to be honest, I wasn't looking through the chat, so I don't know if there were any questions there.
Yeah, we tried to hit all of them, I think. Asked about oil and gas, what you thought about that. So we talked a little bit about sanctions, talked about what is tribalism that important from the Christian perspective? How does tribalism play in?
Yeah, I'm not really, I saw that question. It's an interesting question, and I'm not really sure where, Loretta, where you were going with that, but tribalism, another word for tribalism would be hypernationalism, or just nationalism in a lot of ways. That is a form of tribalism. Partisanship is a form of tribalism. So I think from a Christian perspective, I'm not really sure where you were going with the tribalism stuff, but I think from just a human perspective, tribalism is dangerous, right? Because tribalism it works on ins and outs. You're part of the tribe, you're out, you're not part of the tribe. And in creating those in and out groups, you create groups that feel legitimate to disenfranchise, to persecute, to ridicule, to attack. So I think tribalism in most forms is something we should probably shy away from.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in the 80s, we heard a lot about globalism and coming together as a world community. And I think what I tend to see is a lot more tribalism, even in the U.S. Politics has become a tribal pursuit, even
Yeah.
even within political parties now. There are tribes within the tribes themselves, and so I think you see a huge increase across the world, and in the United States included, in tribalistic mindsets, and oftentimes not healthy.
Yeah. And to answer your question, Loretta, yeah, I do think I think NATO could be viewed through that lens of tribalism, but I also think you have to understand the context of the creation of NATO. The horrors of World War II were something unseen on a human scale, and ended with something, the most horrific thing we've ever seen in conflict, which was our own use of nuclear weaponry on civilian targets. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not strategical military targets, and we dropped 2 atomic bombs, um, ushering in a nuclear age. Right, the horror of that, and the global contestation between the United States and the Soviet Union over who was going to shape the future of the world, um, and through a number of, well, after World War II, you had a lot of independence movements in the continent of Africa, in Indochina, uh, India, South America. There were independence movements across the globe as a result of the breakup of colonies and colonization efforts prior to World War II. So, who were all those independent nations going to ally with? Were they going to institute uh, democratic societies with capitalist market economies, or were they going to institute communist regimes or totalitarian regimes with planned economies and sort of Soviet style structuring? So, in that context, NATO made sense. The United Nations made sense because you had these 2 competing global ideologies in an era of now nuclear destructive capabilities. And those organizations, both NATO and the UN, were organizations that were created to find another way, whatever that way may be, to find some other way besides war, because any war after 1945 was going to be a threat to all humankind. So I think in that sense, you can also make the argument, and it seems contradictory, and it seems like I'm just wishy-washy and going back and forth here, but you can also make the argument that NATO was much larger than simple tribalism, because it was an effort to acknowledge that all humankind would suffer under a war after 1945.
So, last question I think that was in there was about China. Any thoughts on China, their involvement, lack of involvement? It sounds like clearly they're involved on some level, but
Yeah, I mean, China is walking a fine line now, because Russia is an important trading partner for China, so it's important to uh, the Chinese economy, but it's also has this long historical connection going back to the 1920s, and the Comintern associations between China, a rising communist China, which didn't fully turn communist until 1949, but the Comintern was already meeting with people like Mao in the 1920s, and so they have this sort of long historical relationship, friendly relationship, very different though. Chinese, even under communism, and I would argue that China today, even though they have a communist party, is not the same communism as China was under Mao Zedong's rule. That long shared history also diverged in some kind of important ways. So China has a very sort of thin line to walk here as far as maintaining this historical and important economic and diplomatic relationship with Russia on the one hand, but at the same time, I think China recognizes that this is an unsustainable kind of situation, that they can't just support Russia in this. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out with China and how China eventually comes down to all of this.
Well, Sam, I really appreciate you taking time to be here tonight and answering all of my questions.
Sure. I don't know if I answered anything actually, but I talked for a while.
You did answer a lot of questions and gave a lot of insight. And so I really appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Talk to you soon.
All right. Take care.